go ahead and get started. From Walden University's Career Services Center, welcome to our webinar, The Building Blocks of Starting a Nonprofit Organization. I'm Lisa Cook, Senior Director of Career Services, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our Career Services Center team. Our mission is based on preparing our learners to navigate career transition through educating, coaching, and advising. Here is our Career Services team from left to right: Dina Bergman, Nicole Skalski, who is helping us with today's presentation, Denise Pranke, and Andrea O'Bricky. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we introduce our presenter, Nicole, will you please launch a poll for our audience?
Absolutely. So we'd like to reach out to our audience. What sector are you currently working in? And you should see the poll appearing on your screen. Are you in the nonprofit sector, private sector, public sector, or other? So we'll give everyone a moment to put in their votes before we close the poll. Okay, it looks like about 60% have voted. A few more seconds. And we're getting some interesting results, looks like across the board. Okay, and 3, 2, 1, we'll close the poll. Thank you everyone for participating. It looks like, and we'll share the results, 33% in the nonprofit sector, 39% in the private sector, 17% in the public sector, and 11% other. So very interesting kind of across the board.
Excellent, thank you. So with that, let's go ahead and introduce our faculty presenter today. Our presenter is Dr. Gary Kelsey. Dr. Kelsey is core faculty with the Walden University School of Public Policy and Administration, and he's also an organizational development consultant. Nicole, can you please advance to the next slide? Great, terrific. And so there's our presenter, Dr. Gary Kelsey. And Dr. Kelsey has had 37 years in the nonprofit sector. He's had an eclectic career in a variety of nonprofits, from grassroots to larger, more traditional organizations. His areas of interest and specialization include board development and training, fundraising, and strategic planning. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kelsey.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today and with you for the next hour. The poll results are really interesting because one of the things this may speak to, I'm guessing of it here, is that since 33% of you are already in the nonprofit sector, 39% in the for-profit, and 17% in government, we may have some folks with us today that are interested in either creating their new organization, who already have some expertise or involvement in nonprofits, but those of you in the for-profit and government sectors may also be interested perhaps in switching sectors. And one way that people often do that is to create their own nonprofits. So really happy and excited to be with you today. We're going to cover a broad array of topics, and I just want to note again, this is an overview, so I can't help, the instructor in me has to say read about all of these things, but I hope this will provide you with kind of a broad overview of what you need as you may begin to think about creating a nonprofit. And so we're going to talk, as we get started, about the need for a nonprofit. We will define it, and we'll start talking about the broad vision and mission of the nonprofit organization. Talk about the role of the board of directors as well as those of staff and volunteers. We'll cover some of the legal issues, or things that you'll need to keep in mind related to legal considerations when creating a nonprofit. Touch a bit also on budgeting and funding for your nonprofit, which is a big issue and an important one in creating a new organization. And then lastly, we'll provide you some additional resources as you possibly consider moving forward. So let's start at the beginning. Always a good place to start. What is a nonprofit organization? Well, I think most of us have stepped into a museum, maybe have gone into a Goodwill store, have gone to an art gallery, perhaps walked in a nature center. Even some long-term care and health centers are nonprofit organizations. So nonprofits exist everywhere in our lives, and we all access them, whether we think about it actively or not. They basically provide programs and services in all areas of our life, including the arts, human services, the environment, the advocacy organizations, healthcare, etc., and others. And what they're interesting, currently there are about 1.2 million nonprofit organizations in the U.S. that are registered as nonprofits. They have combined revenues of approximately $621 billion, that's billion with a B, not an M, which represents 6.2% of the nation's economy. So it is a large part of our economy, and therefore, of course, it's a large part of our employment sector as well. Right now, an estimated 10.2 million people are employed in some fashion in the nonprofit sector. I'm often asked, well, how does it differ? And in some ways it doesn't differ a lot because both organizations have, if you will, customers, except in the nonprofit organization, your customers really are your clients, and it's tied very closely to your mission. But both have a mission, and they have a need for revenue to survive. Probably one of the biggest differences is that in a for-profit organization, you have a profit, or you have dividends or funds that go to pay your stockholders. Where in a nonprofit, any money, any extra revenue, if there is any, goes back into the organization to further the mission of the organization and to serve its constituents. Both organizations also have staff, but in the nonprofit sector, certainly the use of volunteers is a very, very important aspect of the organization, both within the programs and at the governance board level. As I think back over all my many years in nonprofits, some of the best advice I can give folks who are thinking of entering into or creating a nonprofit is to first do a needs assessment. Can you clearly articulate the problem or the need that you want to address? Do you have any data? Do you have anecdotal stories? But what exactly is the need? Unfortunately, when I talk with folks who run nonprofits a lot, they'll tell me what they do to serve a need. For instance, if I'm talking with someone from a battered women's shelter, they may tell me that they have a shelter where people can come to be safe, that they have an advocacy program at the state government, that they also have education programs in the schools to help kids understand alternatives to violence and ways of dealing with stress. But that's not the problem. The real problem is that we live in a violent society in which people are still emotionally, physically, are battered and abused, and that's the key problem. So we have to be able to really clearly articulate the problem in order to create and bring people close to our organization who want to both fund it and who want to be a part of it in terms of program volunteers and board members. And so homelessness, poverty, family violence, hunger, gang violence, teen pregnancy, those are really the problem that underpins then the organization and then the services that will provide to address this problem. But that's key, that we can be able to motivate people by being able to articulate the problem. Then can you identify the causes that lead to the problem or the need so that people can understand a lot of these issues like poverty, homelessness, and hunger, they're large systemic complex issues. And as Walden students know, we talk a lot about critical thinking and complexity and systems thinking. And so it's important to be able to understand the causes that lead to the problem or the need. We also have to know who's affected by it. Is it, again, older adults, youth, adolescents, women, people from the GLBT community, etc.? Who are the people that are in most need of services that perhaps are not getting them now? And then a crucial question is, do other organizations exist that can address the problem or the need? Are there currently other organizations that may be able to take on this program, or maybe you would be able to join their staff and bring this program to them rather than starting a completely new organization? So if your concern is related to the lack of empowerment of young women and girls, that perhaps you might go first to talk to someone at the Girl Scouts or other organizations like that to see what are they doing to address this need, and possibly can you work with them or collaborate with them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as alternatives. So I think it's exciting to think about starting a new nonprofit, but we have to be really prepared to be able to compel people with the need and to know that there's not going to be duplication.
Next slide.
So if you decide to move ahead, I think the great place to start is vision, the idea of creating a vision statement. It should always be inspiring, and I think that's actually the #1 reason why we have one. I tend to think of a vision statement as something that would put your organization out of business if it were attained, the ideal outcome. And most often, the vision statement is never fully attained, but that still keeps you getting up in the morning, gets you really moving, keeps people excited about supporting your organization. If I can give you an example of one example, the March of Dimes has been around for many, many years. Historically, its original vision was to eradicate polio. Well, lo and behold, polio, for the most part, in this country has been eradicated, but they didn't go away. They, in a sense, now have a new vision related to it, and that's to prevent birth defects. And that is a vision that they're continuing to work towards, because that isn't something that we have been able to overcome. And so just because an organization does meet its vision, if it does, that doesn't mean they go away. There may be a related cause or interest that they can turn their multiple talents towards. So the vision is that ultimate outcome that inspires us to taking action. And another example of a vision statement can be found on the next slide. Walden University has a vision statement, an exciting one. And Walden University envisions a distinctly different 21st century learning community where knowledge is judged worthy to the degree that it can be applied by its graduates to the immediate solutions of critical societal challenges, thereby advancing the greater global good. And as all of you at Walden know, this is really related to our positive social change vision. That doesn't mean that vision statements or mission statements need to be short. They can be sometimes a bit long, because we really are, again, talking about the ideal that we're striving for. That takes us to the mission statement. When you create a mission statement, this is a little bit more distinct and a little more succinct, and generally tells you, again, what's the purpose, why it does it, for whom, and how. And we have a couple of examples in the following slides. Walden's mission statement is they provide a diverse community of career professionals with the opportunity to transform themselves as scholar practitioners so they can affect positive social change. Outside of Walden, here's another one that I've come across. This is a very short one, but I love it because it says exactly what a technical college is all about: education for employment. However, they don't always have to be short. The complexity of the organization, its history, its reach in the community are also really important. So you can see this next one, I won't read it, but the American Cancer Society mission statement also talks about what their purpose is, for whom, and how they do it. I believe we have one more. This next one on the next slide is the Goodwill Industries mission statement. And that talks about helping people reach their fullest potential through the power of work. And anytime you go into a Goodwill or shop at a Goodwill, you'll see that mission statement all over their walls and throughout the organization. So let's move on then to a little more specific, drawing that down like a funnel again into something more specific. Then, of course, as you create your vision and mission statement, your next step is to ask yourself, what programs or services are we going to provide? Is it going to be shelter or rent assistance, counseling, a food shelf, clothes closet, alternative recreation for youth, etc.? Once we really know that critical those issues, the needs for which you're creating the nonprofit, what services are you going to provide that will address that nonprofit? And of course, then the who will provide these. Will it be paid staff? Will it be volunteers, or certainly a combination of the above? And how will these services be provided? Will people come to you? Will you go to them? An example is in transportation. So there's a very great need for transportation for older adults, for people who otherwise may have to prematurely move out of their home and lose their independence. Transportation can be provided through buses, through vans, or an organization may provide vouchers so that people can take taxis that come to their door. There's many ways often to address an issue or a need, and so you have to ask yourself again, how exactly will that happen to fit that niche that you have niche need that you have identified. Next, we're going to talk about a very important aspect of creating a nonprofit organization, and that is the board of directors. In every state, to create a nonprofit organization, you have to start with some incorporators. And the incorporators really are your first board. And states vary. In the state of Minnesota, you need 3 people as incorporators to start a nonprofit. It varies a little bit, but generally 2, 3, 4, 5 people are needed and they're required by the state to create your nonprofit as part of the 501c3 process that we'll talk about a bit later. But then certainly as the board grows, as the organization grows, and certainly this is an incredibly important group of people. The purpose of what we're going to call here a governing board of directors, because every organization has to have a governing board, is to accept and act on the legal authority given them to govern and carry out the mission of their organization. So their role is not to run the organization on a day-to-day basis. That is the role of staff. But their role is to govern, provide policy, to have oversight, and to help support financially the organization. And in terms of types of boards, there are working boards, policy governing boards, and advisory boards. So as you consider creating a nonprofit, you might want to ask yourself, which of these types of boards do you want to have? But every nonprofit organization will have a policy governing board. Often a organization will communicate that it has a working board, and what that often means is that before an organization is large enough and can afford to have its first staff, where your board is actually providing the services, in a sense taking a staff role, that's when we also often call them a working board. However, all boards work because they come to meetings, they set policy, etc. An advisory board does just that. They are there to advise, and often the advice that these advisory boards give to the full governing board is certainly listened to and often taken up and ratified by the full governing board. So board members are fiscally, legally, and morally responsible for the organization. And what I mean by that is it's the duty of each board member to know the budget and take an active part in budget planning and oversight. That's the duty of each board member to understand their legal responsibilities to oversee and evaluate organizational policies and procedures. And each board member should know, understand, and be committed to the mission of the organization. And each board member is expected to govern, plan, and take action based on that mission in its entirety. And that's really a critical piece because board members often come to the organization after they are first program volunteers, or they may come because of the 4 programs that an organization offers. They have become very familiar or active in one of them, but they are called to act on the mission in its entirety. And that we will get a little bit more into that in a bit related to the resources a board needs. A couple of areas where the board is critical, and they're actually critical in most of the aspects of an organization, is in strategic planning. Usually the board with organizational leadership will make the decision of when and how they're going to do strategic planning. And strategic planning really is the process of identifying how an organization intends to create its future and how it's going to get there. And the strategic plan is often a 3 to 5 year plan of action for the organization. Some organizations, however, especially small and emerging organizations, set yearly goals and objectives, or underneath the strategic plan they will have these yearly goals and objectives. And the board might be involved in creating those, certainly involved in ratifying those and approving them. And then lastly, the board can play and should play an active role in fundraising in ways for which they are trained and for which they are supported by staff if staff do exist or they feel that they're gaining the skills that they need to do so. And certainly in related to fundraising, we look for 100% board giving from each of our members of the board. We ask that each board member make a gift that's meaningful to them as well. And so these are just 3 of the areas in which our nonprofit board of directors is critical to an organization's future. Some other things to think about in creating a board. So maybe you're beginning to think about, I want to create this nonprofit organization. Who would want to be on my board, or who could I get to be on my board? The question you really want to ask yourself is, who do we need to have on this board in order to be successful? And that often falls into 3 areas of representation, expertise, and experience. Who should be geographically? If you're a neighborhood organization, are all members of your neighborhood represented? If you're an organization that provides youth services, do we have people who from other youth-serving organizations? How do we get the input of youth on our board? If not in the governing board, in an advisory board. What kind of representation do we need to meet our mission? So you can really look back at that mission and say, who should be at this table? Who should be around this table to be able to provide the fiscal, legal, and moral expertise that we need to move forward? Under expertise, most nonprofits, especially as they are starting, it's a great time to ask yourself, who should be on this board? Do we need people with technology experience to help us with our technology, our computer needs? We certainly will often need somebody who has some fundraising experience and interest. Also maybe somebody with marketing communication expertise. What kind of expertise do we need that will really help us get off the ground and not only survive but to thrive? And then the last one is experience. And there we not only need people with experience in these areas of expertise, but we need people who are good thinkers, who are good communicators, who are team players, who are really good at processing in a group. I kind of think of wealth, wisdom, and weight meaning that they have some connections in the community, they have some weight within the community as the kind of experience that we're looking for. And so experience is really key. And it doesn't mean that someone shouldn't be considered for a board if they don't have a lot of board or nonprofit experience, but we want to make sure then, of course, that they are very well trained and supported. But we do want people with representation, expertise, and experience, and it all again ties back to that mission. Related specifically then to board member recruitment, what I've found over the years is that sometimes nonprofit executive directors, small and large organizations, will tell me that they struggle with board members who either don't understand their role, or they're micromanaging the director, or they don't get involved at all on the other extreme. And so to try and minimize any issues that are problems that can come up with board members and their involvement, and certainly to maximize the relationship between the executive director and the board members, I think we need a great recruitment process, and it has to start with our tools. So just like any job, right, getting a job, I think our career services people would agree that we need a job description. We need to know, is this a match? Is there really a good match there? And we could do a whole webinar on job descriptions and board recruitment alone, but the job description should really be descriptive, not only in what is expected from the, well, in this case it would be a volunteer board member, but what will they get in return? What are the benefits of being a board member? That's really key. And so what kind of expertise, interest, what time commitment is needed, those kind of things are going to be important. What functions will the board member play? All of that needs to be spelled out in a job description so that a potential board member can really make the decision for themselves as well as the organization. Is there a good match here between the mission and the needs of the organization and the individual who wishes to serve? I really like the idea of a application for a board member recruitment, and I've used them and I've seen them. And an application that just asks some basics about past board experience, employment experience and expertise. Certainly, what are your interests and how do you think you can best serve the organization? These would be some of the questions I would put on an application. Because often board members come to our organization because they're recommended by existing board members or people that we know or people who self-identify. But we want to do a reality check to make sure that the information that we know about them, again, is correct and that we are utilizing these people's strength in the most effective way, and effective for them as well as for us. Additional recruitment materials, when you're thinking of recruiting board members, it's really important to make sure that they have something that lists the vision, the mission, and the programs and services offered by the organization. I think if you have some data about the need for the organization, and that's really key to help them kind of understanding, again, the reason why you're here. If there have been any really great newspaper, newsletter articles, blog information, or anything like that that could be communicated, that's wonderful. Two key pieces that I think should go on every bit of recruitment packet, if you will, for potential board members is an existing organizational chart and a list of existing board members, because people want to know, who will I be working with? If I look at that list and I see some names of people that I really enjoy working with or that I really respect them, that is certainly going to make me much more interested perhaps and feel that this is a credible organization that I want to be a part of. And also it's important to understand in terms of the depth of the role of board members is how large is the staff and what are their roles. So we can clearly get a sense as to what roles will staff play versus the role of board members and volunteers, because that role delineation and clarity is really important. Then it's important to always hold a brief interview with the potential board member, and that often would be with the person who they perhaps know who's already on the board, the person who they made contact with, and the executive director. And that's a chance for both the organizational representatives to ask the potential board member questions about themselves, how they want to be involved, what would they like to gain from this experience, but it also gives that potential board member a chance to ask any clarifying questions that they may have related to this experience. So again, that mutuality, which is the last bullet point on here, can really be cemented in, because that mutuality is really key. This should be a mutually responsive relationship, or a mutually satisfying relationship on both sides. It's not just about what we want as staff from this person, but how can we help them become more? And certainly one of the potential interests that people have in joining boards is to help them in their career. There's absolutely nothing wrong with joining a board because you think it may help you network. It may bring you closer to an organization or a sector in which you want to work. However, the number one reason should always be because people have a passion for the mission of the organization. So those are just a few thoughts related to board member recruitment. Once an individual or individuals are a part of your board, then it's important to do orientation, evaluation, support recognition, and training. And orientation is really all about giving them the tools, the resources, the information that they need to do their job. And that may be related to policies, related to reimbursement for parking or mileage. It's, again, reiterating what their role is, perhaps giving them 6 months of past board minutes so that they can get up to speed as they join the board on what's going on, what are the major issues, anything that they need to do their job. I also, in this case, recommend employing the buddy system, where if someone is already a board member, that they take on a new board member as their board buddy, and that maybe they sit next to them at the first meeting, and someone can ask them, whisper some questions if they have any during the meeting, maybe have a cup of coffee after to talk about any questions or clarification they need to make them feel comfortable and welcomed. Also, of course, it's very important to evaluate a board, and boards should evaluate themselves. There should be a process in place to do that, and there actually are in some of the resources that we have for you later. There are some great online evaluation tools out there. Support and recognition is another really key part of this, and that obviously, again, these people are volunteers, so it's very important for us to support them and recognize how important they are. And what we've learned is that often can be generational. Different generations seem to like different kinds of recognition and support. But currently, I think one of the strongest ways, and our research bears this out, that we can thank and recognize our volunteers is just to be a great organization that really does meet its mission and does great work. That's what a lot of people say now spurs them to stay, as an organization that is effective. And training is a bit different than orientation. Training is when there's a specific need or skill, such as understanding how to read a budget or how to do a fundraising ask. That's what training is really all about, and that can be done at the beginning of a volunteer board member's experience or as they work through their board member process.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions now. And actually, Gary, since you were talking a lot about board membership, we have a question from Alice who asks, what do you do when you have founder and board disagreements in terms of the direction for the organization to take?
That's really a terrific question, Alice. I really appreciate that. And I see it quite often as a board consultant. What I do is, as a facilitator on the outside, is I'll always go back to mission. And we will actually first kind of honor both people's opinion and their ideas, but then ask, do both of these, one or both of these, do they fit with the mission? And do both of them further the mission of the organization? And if they do, or one is more than the other, we kind of talk about that, or are there elements in both people's position that we can use within the programs and services that are moving forward. So I think the first thing is to be respectful, because these are volunteers who are giving their time and expertise and financial gifts as well. But I think everything comes back to mission, and that's a great way to depoliticize sometimes some of those issues that come up. And I think often if that happens at board meetings and it's taking up too much time in a board meeting, it's a great chance for the chair and perhaps the executive director to sit down and talk with the two people that are having this disagreement, if you will, and to have a conversation away from a larger board meeting. It also might be a great topic for a board retreat. If you're doing a retreat, this might call to mind that there may be some broader questions about the current mission or direction that you're going into. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. And a related question, can founders be part of the board?
Another wonderful question. Founders can be part of the board. It's a bit tricky. There's something called founder syndrome, which we could do a whole webinar on. But a founder that joins the board really is called to be able to step back from being the founder and to become a board member, because we don't want all of the focus of the conversation, of the planning, et cetera, to go to that one person because they have such a stake in the organization. And they're often charismatic individuals as well. So they need to be hopefully able to step back and become a board member that welcomes and honors the input from all other board members. But I would say that generally staff is not a member of the board, or not a member. Those are two distinct different roles. There are occasions in which that happens, but generally staff are paid staff and board members are volunteers, and that they have two distinct roles.
Great. And one more question on boards. So how long are board terms?
Well, that's a great question also. Board terms vary. Most nonprofit organizations have 2 to 3 year terms. I would say that's the most common. And where things differ is some organizations have no term limits, where a board member could serve any number of 2 or 3 year terms, one after another. And many organizations have term limits, meaning that the bylaws may say that you would serve 1 3-year term, or I'm sorry, maybe 2 3-year terms, and then or the person must go off the board for at least a year, and afterwards they may be nominated to come back on to serve again, but they do have a limit of 2 3-year terms. And frankly, in my experience, that is the best model, because it brings forth new leadership. It helps bring new people into the table, and into the discussion.
Great. Okay, terrific. All right, so we have some more great questions, and we'll get to those towards the end of our presentation.
I see time is going by, so I'm going to move along here. Some of the legal requirements if you're wanting to create a nonprofit is you have to go look at your state to the Articles of Incorporation, which of course this is a legal record of how the organization is to be managed. You have your tax exemption, 501c3 status, which you must have to apply for most foundation grants, and to make any donations to be tax deductible. Your organization must be a 501c3 status. But that is a tax exempt status from the IRS, and you would file for that. And again, you would see your State Department of Revenue or your Attorney General's office website for more information on how to apply for that. Organizational bylaws. These are really the rules by which the organization will operate. It will outline standing committees, will have distinct explanation of roles and the board roles and committee roles, executive committee roles, etc. Some other requirements may vary by state, so I recommend that you learn about your state charitable law requirements. And one of the other things you would need to do is apply for a nonprofit mailing permit. You'll apply for a federal employee ID number, and you'll apply for state sales tax exemption. But always go to your state to find out what specific rules and laws are applicable in your particular state related to the legal requirements of creating a nonprofit. Organizational budget, we're just going to touch on this, but obviously one of the things you have to look at is your revenues. What is it going to take to provide the services and programs that you need to do to address the issue or the needs. So some examples of revenues, though, that you need to take in would be fees, perhaps donations, your fundraising events, which can be everything from special fundraising events like galas, dinners, bike-a-thons, run-a-thon, those kind of things, to contracts with a county or another organization to provide services. And then you have your expenses, which include your staff, your benefits, program costs, office supplies, etc. So you need to know where's your money coming from and how much money is it going to take to move this organization forward, not only now but into the future, because you always have to be planning ahead in your fundraising and looking at your revenue sources. That takes us into a whole area, again, a large area of fundraising and development. This slide is titled, interestingly enough, Fundraising versus Development, because what we've learned over the years and what we used to simply call fundraising, we've now broadened into, I think, a more healthy, holistic approach. Fundraising defined is really the act of asking someone for money, where development is creating a relationship with people, bringing people close to your organization. And one outcome of that investment or bringing them close may be an investment of money and or time, because philanthropy is not just money, it's also volunteer time. And so this assumes that at the beginning of your nonprofit's creation, all through the life of the nonprofit, that you are creating, maintaining, and building relationships, because that will result in both volunteerism and financial support for the organization.
So once again, networking is key.
Network is always key, building relationships and networking. The next slide, I tend to break development, again, this holistic approach, into 5 steps. Identification, which is who has the money, who have the resources. And resources aren't necessarily cash. They may also be in kind. They may be office supplies, office equipment, office space, etc. But who has it? We have to start with who has it. Then we start by cultivating a relationship with potential donors. How do we bring them close to us? How do we create that relationship? How do we network with them? And then once we brought them close to us, if you will, and have kind of made that introduction and started to create a relationship, how do we educate them about the need that underpins our organization and the services that we provide to address that need? Both pieces are so important. Once you've gone through those 2 steps, then it's appropriate to begin to ask for money. We often, tongue-in-cheek, say in development that money doesn't generally surrender and walk in the door. You do have to ask for it. So solicitation is all about asking. And that can be a little scary at times, and that's natural, but your passion for your organization should really be stronger than any fear related to asking for money. And as you think about it, it's a lot like moving. If I met someone, if I met Lisa or Nicole for the first time today, and then I called them afterwards and said, it's great to meet you, would you help me move this weekend? They probably would come up with an excuse, because they're nice people, and say no. But if we cultivated a relationship, we got to know each other, and we got to know a lot more about each other's lives, and we got involved in each other's lives, and we helped each other out of it, then it would make more sense for me to ask. And the same thing is true in fundraising, is once you've cultivated a relationship and people are educated and involved, and that can happen as something as easy as going out for a cup of coffee or bringing them to a special event, bringing them in to see what you do in your organization and its outcomes, then when you ask people, it's more of a natural progression. And it's not so much, it's not so scary. And the last step is so critically important, and that's appreciation. And often gifts will come in unsolicited if we appreciate. And one of the new tactics, again, we could do a whole webinar on fundraising, is to do a thank-a-thon, where board members, as volunteers, will call donors and not ask for anything, not ask for any money, but simply call and thank them for their last gift and tell them a little bit about what the organization is doing with those funds to move it forward. And that's a way of cultivating and further educating as well as appreciating them. So in my mind, this is more holistic, the holistic steps in development. Many of you know that there are lots of development sources, and a nonprofit that is going to sustain itself over time will begin at the very beginning to develop a diversified portfolio of funding sources. So that can include any of these on this list, and with the idea that sometimes foundations and government grants will ebb and flow. Or foundations may change their priorities, that given those cases where it's tougher to get foundation grants, you have individual gifts, from very small gifts all the way to major gifts, maybe eventually people who leave money in their will, or you have an endowment, etc., that will make up for that. And you may have some earned income by a service or selling something related to the mission of your organization. Membership fees if you're a membership organization, and of course special events is another great way to actually meet all 5 of those steps. Special events can identify new donors, it can cultivate and educate, you can certainly ask for additional gifts at those, and they certainly are a great place to thank people. Let's switch gears now, just talking about the 2 key components of staff and program volunteers. Staff roles, again, are different than program volunteers, even though they can certainly intertwine. The staff are certainly, they tend to live, eat, and breathe the organization every day, but volunteers can play critical roles, both in the program and, of course, as we already talked about, as board volunteers. And so staff and program volunteers can work very closely together, but usually volunteers are supervised by staff. And that will, as you create a new organization, there may be very few staff or maybe none, and the organization may initially provide services with volunteers. But as you begin to raise some funding, get that first grant, etc., when staff are hired, they can begin to put in place some policies and procedures and some evaluation and support systems related to program volunteers. But volunteers in many organizations, I ran an emergency services agency, and we had volunteers work in our clothes closet, in the food shelf. We had volunteer drivers. We could not have survived and provided the services that we did without them. We simply were a small organization with only 5 staff. And so they were critical to our work. So think creatively if you are creating a nonprofit into how you might involve and use program volunteers. But also always think about it as a mutually satisfying relationship. Not only what do we want from them, but what are we going to give them in return?
So now we're going to run a second poll. So Nicole, do you want to push that poll for us?
Sure. For some reason, okay, I've got it. My go-to disappeared. Okay, so as we're listening to Gary inform us about this process, and as we wrap up our program, we'd want to get some feedback as far as, are you thinking of creating a nonprofit within the next year?
So now that you've got all these great ideas and strategies and you know some of the hurdles that you might need to jump, what is your thinking right now about this? What are your plans?
Okay. Interesting results. Okay, we're going to close them up and share. So overwhelmingly, 46% say yes, they are thinking of creating a nonprofit within the next year, and running up is considering it, and 17% say no, but probably would like to get involved, yeah, in a nonprofit in some way or another. Go ahead, Gary.
So if I'm doing my math correctly, that looks like about 83% of people are either going to do this or are considering it. That's really exciting. Again, I've worked in startup organizations and those that are quite large, and I can tell you that while it's certainly a significant amount of work to do this, it can be incredibly exciting. It's very meaningful and certainly speaks to Walden's positive social change mission and vision. And so I'm very excited to hear this. It can be worth every minute of the time and effort it takes to do it, as long as it's gone into, again, with a lot of foresight, with a lot of planning, and very thoughtfully and creatively.
Great. So what about the folks who are thinking they might not start one?
There's some alternatives we have for us. Again, I may have hinted at this a little bit in the beginning, but again, if you decide, you know what, I really have this program or service in mind, and I think it's unique, I think it's meeting an unmet need, but I'm not sure I really want to create a new organization, or maybe I'm not in a position to do that, we would still encourage you to go talk to organizations that serve that same or similar population and ask them, you know, can I collaborate with you? Can we collaborate on creating a new organization? You might even create your own new job, potentially. If you bring an idea or a program to an organization, you might even create a position for yourself in doing so. You may go to another organization and help them create this as a brand new program. You might also look at this as a local chapter of a state or a national organization that already exists. Take a look, maybe there's something going on out there in another state or another part of your region, but it's not going on in your area, and maybe that you could start up a new chapter of this organization. Often organizations, when they start up, they're a little intimidated or struggling with some of the financial aspects of this. And in that case, you can actually seek out an existing 501c3 nonprofit to act as your fiscal sponsor, which means that they would handle the finance piece of your work until you're up and running, which a lot of organizations do until they get their 501c3 status, and some even do afterwards because they just don't feel they can handle that financial aspect and the oversight of that. And then the other is simply to maintain or create an informal volunteer organization. There are a lot of neighborhood organizations and groups that get together to address a need and do something, but they don't have formal 501c3 status, so they're not a civic nonprofit organization. So certainly you can begin your own movement, your own organization, without having to have that formal status.
Terrific. Okay, so we have some more questions. And so, Gary, what is the difference between a nonprofit organization and an NGO?
Great question. Generally, NGO, which is a non-governmental organization, is the language that is used outside of the U.S. and somewhat outside of North America, but I would say definitely outside of the U.S. and certainly in other parts of the world, you will see non-governmental organization. Some folks, and we joke about this, that nonprofit sometimes sounds a little negative, that we're the only sector that talks about ourselves by what we're not versus what we are. So in some ways, I like the idea of non-governmental, or the third sector even sometimes it's called. So it's generally the same thing. It's just a different way of labeling it, another way of talking about it.
Great. Thank you. And another question, from your experience, what do you think about family members making up the majority of an advisory board upon initial start of a nonprofit?
I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but I like the fact that you said advisory board, because an advisory board, their role is to just do that, give advice. And so as long as the family members understand that the recommendations or the advice they give to the policy board may or may not be adopted, that's great. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it's important that there be role clarity between those two different types of boards.
Okay, and so we have two questions on 501c3 status. Is there a time limit to apply for a 501c3 status after being incorporated?
To my knowledge, no. That's an ongoing process.
Okay, and the second question, can you combine a 501c3 and a for-profit organization?
I want to be careful here, because there are nonprofits that certainly have started some for-profit entities, and you can do that. You certainly can do that, but you want to check with your state about specific rules, laws, and regulations related to that in your state. But yes, it does happen that they will provide some kind of a for-profit. Like some nonprofits now are starting perhaps like thrift stores or something, other ways of earned income that might be a profit-making.
Got it. And then last question, how do you find fiscal sponsorship?
The best way to do that is to look for other organizations that are similar to your type of organization. I currently sit on the board of a regional arts organization, and they are the fiscal sponsor for several other real small galleries and art organizations in that same geographic area. So you might look for more established organizations that do something similar or serve the same groups of people or population that you would serve.
Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. So we're ready to wrap up, and Gary's going to quickly review some extra resources to help you in this endeavor, and we'll talk about career services briefly. And we ask that you all please answer the brief survey that you'll receive when you log off the webinar. Okay.
What you see in front of you is a list. Some of these are federal websites. Again, always go to your Secretary of State website and Attorney General. The state of Minnesota, it has just a wonderful example of that. It's terrific. It has all kinds of policies, procedures. I believe there, in some cases, you'll even find booklets and guides on how to start a nonprofit. Most states have a council on nonprofits, so I would Google or look for that, as well as a state council on foundations. And both of those have tremendous information. There's some private organization websites. BoardSource is national. You can certainly look for that. Map for Nonprofits is in Minnesota, but they have an incredible free library or just a resource list amongst at their website that would be incredibly helpful to you. The Chronicle of Philanthropy is probably one of the main magazines, a professional pieces on this, that you find something you might want to get that online or on paper. And then the foundationcenter.org is a national organization. Every state has a branch of the Foundation Center. And again, there's a website there because they are a terrific resource for gaining grants of all kinds.
Terrific. Thank you. So we've gotten a question, can I get a copy of these PowerPoint slides, and you know, how can I view this webinar in case I missed the beginning? So just so you know, the webinar will be archived with the slides on our website within about a week. And so our Career Center website is the link at the bottom, careercenter.waldenu.edu. We encourage you to join our Walden University Career Services Center LinkedIn group because, as Dr. Kelsey was saying, networking is key in starting a nonprofit and developing your career and a lot of other endeavors, and we just passed the 2,000 member mark for that group, so we're growing on a daily basis. Also, please follow us on Twitter, and you can read student success stories on our blog, and also check out Optimal Resume if you'd like to update your resume or your CV. So we want to thank you very much for attending today, and we'll leave you with one final thought from Woodrow Wilson. You are not here merely to make a living. You are here in order to enable the world to live more amply with greater vision, with the finer spirit of hope and achievement. You are here to enrich the world, and you impoverish yourself if you forget the errand. And so thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you very much, Dr. Gary Kelsey, for joining us today.
Thank you to all of you. If you have successes, please email.